Picture this. A cold Milwaukee night in 1978. The kind where your breath freezes before it leaves your lips. Inside a dimly lit social club on the city's near north side, men in tailored suits gather around tables covered in green felt. Cigars burn. Whiskey flows. Money changes hands. And at the center of it all sits a man they call Frankie Bal, a man whose word could make you rich or bury you 6 feet under Wisconsin soil. Frank Balistrieri. The name might not ring bells like Capone or Gotti, but in the American Midwest, from the Prohibition-era through the glittering casino days of Las Vegas, this man built an empire that stretched from cheese factories to desert casinos, from bootleg whiskey to the Teamsters Pension Fund. This is the story of Wisconsin's most powerful mob boss, a man who ruled Milwaukee's underworld with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, who sat down with presidents and gangsters alike, who controlled millions while maintaining the facade of a simple businessman. But before we dive into the shadows of this incredible true story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Are you watching this late at night, deep in the darkness like Frankie preferred to operate? Or are you watching in broad daylight, fascinated by the shadows of history? Let me know. I love hearing from fellow students of the underworld. Now, let's step back in time. Back to when Milwaukee was known for more than just beer. Back to when a young Sicilian boy arrived in America with nothing but fire in his belly and ice in his veins. This is the story of Frank Balistrieri's bootleg dynasty. Asterisk, every empire begins with a seed. And Frank Balistrieri's seed was planted in the hardscrabble soil of Milwaukee's 3rd Ward in 1918. But to truly understand Frankie Bal, we have to go back even further, back to the sun-scorched hills of Sicily, where the Code of Omerta was written in blood long before it ever reached American shores. Frank's father, Joseph Balistrieri, arrived in Milwaukee from Sicily in the early 1900s, part of that great wave of Italian immigration that would reshape American cities. Joseph wasn't a gangster, at least not in the traditional sense. He was a grocer, a businessman, a man trying to carve out an honest living in a new world that didn't always play fair. He opened a small grocery store in the 3rd Ward, Milwaukee's Little Italy, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of the lake and the sounds of Sicilian dialects echoed through narrow streets. On January 17, 1918, in the coldest part of a brutal Wisconsin winter, Joseph's wife gave birth to their son, Frank Peter Balistrieri. The world he was born into was one of opportunity and oppression, promise and prejudice. Italian immigrants weren't exactly welcomed with open arms in Milwaukee. They were the cheap labor, the unwanted, the ones who got blamed when things went wrong. But they had something the American establishment didn't count on. They had each other. They had family. They had the old ways. Young Frank grew up in a world of contradictions. By day, his father ran a legitimate grocery business. But the 3rd Ward wasn't just about honest commerce. It was a breeding ground for a different kind of entrepreneurship, the kind that operated in shadows and dealt in commodities the law said couldn't be sold. This was the era of Prohibition, remember. The 18th Amendment had turned America into a nation of criminals overnight. Want a beer in Milwaukee, the beer capital of America? You were breaking the law. Want a shot of whiskey to warm up after a freezing day on the docks? criminal, the law had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed men who understood that moral laws and legal laws weren't always the same thing. Frank was a brilliant student, but not in the traditional sense. He watched, he learned. He saw how the neighborhood actually worked. He saw the men his father had to pay protection money to. He saw who really had power and who just thought they did. By the time he was a teenager, Frank Balistrieri had learned the most important lesson of his life. In America, it didn't matter where you came from. What mattered was how smart you were and how ruthless you could be, when ruthlessness was required. But Frank was also different from the typical street thug. His parents insisted on education. Frank didn't just graduate high school, he went to college. He actually went to law school, studying at Notre Dame and then Marquette University in Milwaukee. Can you imagine that? A future mob boss studying constitutional law and criminal procedure? But that's exactly what made Frank Balistrieri so dangerous. He understood the system from the inside. He knew how to exploit it, how to manipulate it, how to make it work for him instead of against him. The 1940s were formative years for young Frank. World War II had reshaped America, and when the boys came home, they came back to a country ready to explode with prosperity. Milwaukee was booming. The factories were running 3 shifts, money was flowing. And wherever money flows, organized crime follows, because organized crime is just capitalism without the paperwork. Frank's real education didn't come from textbooks, though. It came from the social clubs, the back rooms, the whispered conversations between men who ran the real Milwaukee. He became friends with the Brindisi brothers, Milwaukee mob royalty. He learned from Johnny Alioto, a Milwaukee mob leader who understood that the real money wasn't in busting heads. It was in looking legitimate while doing illegitimate things. By his early 20s, Frank had developed a reputation. He was smart, almost dangerously so. He was calm under pressure. He could negotiate. He could intimidate. And most importantly, he understood something that a lot of street-level gangsters never grasped. Violence was a tool, not a solution. You used it sparingly, strategically, and only when absolutely necessary. The real power came from controlling things that people wanted: alcohol, gambling, labor unions, entertainment. Control the supply, control the demand, and you control the money. In 1945, Frank married Antonina Alioto, daughter of John Alioto. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger, a strategic alliance between 2 of Milwaukee's most connected Italian families. Antonina, or Nina as everyone called her, wasn't just a mob wife. She was the daughter of royalty in the Milwaukee underworld, and through her, Frank gained legitimacy, connections, and most importantly, trust from the old-timers who might have otherwise seen him as too ambitious, too modern, too American. They had 4 children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and Frank maintained the image of a devoted family man throughout his life. Sunday dinners, church on Christmas and Easter, kids in Catholic schools. From the outside, the Balistrieris looked like the American dream incarnate. Successful businessman, beautiful wife, accomplished children. But inside those family gatherings, in the quiet conversations after the children went to bed, other business was being discussed. Business that had nothing to do with groceries or legitimate real estate. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw Frank starting to build his own organization. He wasn't content to be someone's lieutenant forever. He had vision, and that vision extended far beyond Milwaukee's Third Ward. He saw the future, and the future was about diversification. Don't just run numbers, invest in legitimate businesses. That can launder the money. Don't just control one aspect of vice, control it all, from top to bottom. Create a vertical monopoly on sin. Frank started small, as all great empires do. Vending machines seems innocent enough, right? Wrong. Vending machines in the 1950s were cash businesses, perfect for laundering money. You could report whatever income you wanted, mix illegal money with legal quarters and nickels, and suddenly dirty money became clean money. Frank's vending machine business grew rapidly, spreading through Milwaukee bars, restaurants, and social clubs. But the machines weren't just about cigarettes and candy. They were about control. Once Frank's machines were in your establishment, you were connected to Frank. And being connected to Frank meant you paid Frank. It meant you didn't work with Frank's competitors. It meant you were in the family, whether you realized it or not. But vending machines were just the beginning, just the foundation. Frank had bigger plans. He looked at what the great organized crime families had built in other cities, the outfit in Chicago, the 5 families in New York, and he saw that. The real money, the money that could make you untouchable, came from 3 things: gambling, unions, and going legitimate. Or at least appearing legitimate while maintaining your criminal infrastructure. By the mid-1950s, Frank Balistrieri was no longer just Joseph the grocer's son. He was becoming a power player in Milwaukee's underworld. He had his hands in labor. Unions, particularly the Teamsters, that great piggy bank of American organized crime. He had gambling operations running smoothly. He had legitimate businesses generating paperwork that made everything look clean. And he had something else, something that would define his entire career. He had patience. Frank understood that the quick score, the flashy hit, the newspaper headline, those things got you killed or imprisoned. The real gangsters, the ones who died old and rich, were the ones who played the long game. The ones who built slowly, carefully, methodically. The ones who made alliances instead of enemies. The ones who understood that in the criminal underworld, today's competitor might be tomorrow's partner, and today's partner might be tomorrow's corpse. You had to be flexible. You had to be smart. And above all, you had to be patient. As the 1950s progressed, Milwaukee's organized crime structure was changing. The old bosses were dying off or losing power. The young Turks, the American-born generation, were starting to take over. And among them, Frank Balistrieri was positioning himself not just as a participant, but as a leader. He was building relationships, not just in Milwaukee, but across the Midwest. He was connecting with the Chicago outfit, the most powerful criminal organization in the region. He was showing them that he could be trusted, that he could make money, that he understood the rules. But there was one thing standing between Frank and total control of Milwaukee. There were other players, other organizations, other men who wanted the crown. And in the underworld, there's only room for one king. The question wasn't whether Frank would make his move for total power. The question was when and how bloody it would be when he did. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And Frank Balistrieri the grocer's son who studied law and married into mob royalty, was about to make his play for an empire. The Bootleg dynasty was about to truly begin. Asterisk, the year was 1961 and Milwaukee was at a crossroads. The city was changing, and nowhere was that change more apparent than in the shadowy world of organized crime. The old guard was dying off, literally. Stefano Magaddino's influence was waning. The Kansas City mob's reach into Milwaukee was weakening. And into this power vacuum stepped Frank Balistrieri, no longer content to be a player in someone else's game. He was ready to run his own table, but becoming the boss of Milwaukee wasn't like applying for a job. There was no interview process, no democratic election. In the world Frank inhabited, power was taken, not given. And taking power required something Frank had in abundance: strategic ruthlessness combined with political savvy. The existing Milwaukee mob leadership was fragmented. There were old-timers who'd come up during Prohibition, men who'd built their empires on bootleg liquor and hadn't evolved with the times. There were independents, criminals who operated on their own without paying tribute to any organization. And there were ambitious younger men, like Frank, who saw the chaos as an opportunity. Frank's approach was methodical. He didn't come in guns blazing like some two-bit thug from a dime novel. Instead, he used every tool at his disposal: political connections he'd cultivated, relationships with the Chicago outfit, economic leverage through his legitimate businesses, and yes, when necessary, the threat of violence. But the threat was usually enough. Frank had a saying: "The gun you don't have to fire is the most powerful weapon you own." His first major move was consolidating control over gambling operations throughout Milwaukee. Illegal gambling was the lifeblood of organized crime in the Midwest. Numbers rackets, sports betting, illegal casinos, these weren't just profitable. They were constant revenue streams that kept money flowing even when other operations hit dry spells. Frank systematically approached every independent gambling operator in Milwaukee with a simple proposition: work with him and prosper, or work against him and suffer the consequences. Most chose to work with him. They'd heard stories about what happened to people who opposed Frank Balistrieri. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make the newspapers. People just disappeared, or their businesses burned down, or they suddenly found themselves under investigation by the very police officers they'd been bribing for years. Frank had connections everywhere: in the police department, in City Hall, in the state legislature. He'd spent years building these relationships, investing in them like a farmer plants seeds for future harvests. One of his key alliances was with the Teamsters Union, specifically with the Central States Pension Fund. Now, for those who don't know, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund was one of the greatest criminal enterprises in American history, though technically legal. It was a multi-billion-dollar fund that was supposed to be for union workers' retirements. But in reality, it became a private bank for the mob. Want to build a casino in Las Vegas? The Teamsters Fund would loan you the money, no questions asked. Need to finance a legitimate business to launder illegal profits? The Teamsters Fund was there for you. Frank's connection to the Teamsters gave him something that street-level criminals never had: access to virtually unlimited capital. He could finance operations that other mob bosses could only dream about. He could invest in legitimate businesses that would generate clean money and provide jobs for his associates. And most importantly, he could loan money to people who needed it, putting them in his debt both financially and, more importantly, personally. By 1963, Frank Balistrieri was the undisputed boss of the Milwaukee crime family. He'd achieved what many thought impossible. He'd united the fractious, independent criminal elements of Milwaukee under one organization. His organization, the Milwaukee family, as it became known, wasn't the biggest crime family in America. It didn't have the numbers of New York or the pure power of Chicago. But per capita, man for man, it was one of the most efficient and profitable organizations in the country. Frank ran his organization like a corporation, because that's essentially what it was, a criminal corporation. He had different divisions: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, legitimate businesses. Each division had managers who reported to him. Money flowed up the chain and protection flowed down. It was a pyramid scheme in the purest sense, except instead of selling vitamins or cosmetics, they were selling security, opportunity, and access to the American dream, albeit through criminal means. But Frank's genius wasn't just in organization. It was in diversification. He understood that the mob couldn't survive on traditional rackets alone. Times were changing. The FBI was getting more sophisticated. RICO statutes were being developed that would eventually devastate the mob. Frank saw the writing on the wall earlier than most, and he responded by going increasingly legitimate, at least on paper. He invested in restaurants, prime real estate, legitimate vending machine companies, even a taxi company. These weren't just fronts. They were actual businesses that actually made money. The fact that they also provided excellent opportunities to launder illegal proceeds and employ associates who needed legitimate-looking jobs was just a bonus. Frank Balistrieri, mob boss, had business cards that said businessman, and technically, it wasn't even a lie. His home life remained carefully separated from his professional life, at least publicly. He lived in a nice but not ostentatious house. His children went to good schools. Nina was active in church and community organizations. The Balistrieris were, to all outward appearances, a successful Italian-American family living the American dream. That the dream was financed by illegal gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering was something the neighbors didn't need to know. But being the boss brought challenges that mere soldiers and even lieutenants never faced. The main challenge was managing relationships with other crime families, particularly the Chicago outfit. Milwaukee was technically independent, but it was also in Chicago's backyard. The outfit, led during this time by Sam Momo Giacana and later by Joey the Clown Lombardo and Tony Big Tuna Accardo, viewed Milwaukee as part of their territory, or at least their sphere of influence. Frank walked a delicate tightrope. He needed Chicago's blessing to operate, but he also needed to maintain Milwaukee's independence. He did this through a combination of respect, profit sharing, and demonstrating that a strong Milwaukee family was actually good for Chicago. He gave the outfit a taste of his operations, a percentage here, a favor there, but he never became Chicago's puppet. He remained Milwaukee's boss, taking advice from Chicago but not orders. This balance was tested multiple times throughout the 1960s. There were meetings, tense negotiations in back rooms of Chicago restaurants where Frank had to defend his autonomy, while not appearing disrespectful to men who could theoretically have him killed. But Frank had leverage. Milwaukee was profitable and stable under his leadership. Why would Chicago want to destabilize that? Better to have a strong, reliable ally than to try to directly control territory that might become rebellious and unprofitable. The 1960s also saw Frank expanding his vision beyond Milwaukee, beyond even the Midwest. He started looking west, too. A desert oasis that was rapidly becoming the gambling capital of America, Las Vegas. The Chicago outfit had interests in Vegas, as did crime families from New York, Kansas City, and other cities. Frank saw an opportunity. Milwaukee might be a small family, but that didn't mean they couldn't have a seat at the biggest table in the game. Through his Teamsters connections, Frank began investing in Las Vegas casinos. Not directly. That would draw too much attention, but through a complex web of loans, partnerships, and hidden ownership stakes. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund was financing casino construction and operation, and Frank made sure Milwaukee got its piece of the action. He installed trusted associates as casino managers and supervisors. He ensured that Milwaukee had a skim operation running, taking untaxed cash off the top before it could be counted and reported. The Vegas connection was brilliant for multiple reasons. First, it was incredibly profitable. The skim from just one major casino could bring in more money than all of Frank's Milwaukee operations combined. Second, it was harder to trace. The money came from Nevada, passed through multiple hands and accounts, and by the time it reached Milwaukee, it looked clean. Third, it gave Frank prestige. A mob boss with Vegas interests was playing in the major leagues, no longer just a regional player, but a national figure in organized crime. But success breeds attention, and attention was something organized crime could ill afford. The FBI's interest in the mob was intensifying. Director J. Edgar Hoover, who'd initially denied that organized crime even existed, had been forced to acknowledge its reality and was now throwing resources at dismantling it. Agents were developing informants, planting bugs, following money. Trails. The golden age of the American mob was approaching its twilight. Though few realized it at the time, Frank was more aware than most. He'd studied law, remember. He understood RICO statutes before they were even fully implemented. He knew that the old ways of doing business, the traditional mob structure with clear hierarchies and regular meetings, were becoming liabilities. He started being more careful, using payphones instead of office phones, speaking in code, avoiding being seen with known criminals. He maintained his legitimate businessman image more carefully than ever. By the end of the 1960s, Frank Balistrieri sat atop a criminal empire that stretched from Milwaukee to Las Vegas, from legitimate businesses to illegal enterprises, from local politics to national organized crime. He was, in many ways, the perfect American gangster. Smart, sophisticated, violent when necessary, but preferring negotiation, equally comfortable in a boardroom or a back alley. But empires, even criminal ones, require constant vigilance to maintain. And in the 1970s, Frank Balistrieri would face challenges that would test everything he'd built, from federal investigations to internal betrayals, from Las Vegas skimming operations to the changing nature of crime itself. The rise had been methodical and impressive. The fall, when it came, would be equally dramatic. Las Vegas in the 1970s wasn't the corporate sanitized theme park it would later become. It was still a mob town, a desert mirage where dreams were manufactured and money was extracted from willing marks who thought they might beat the house. Every major crime family in America wanted a piece of the action, and Frank Balistrieri, the boss of Little Milwaukee, had managed to elbow his way to the table with the big boys. The jewel in Frank's Vegas crown was his connection to several casinos, but most importantly to the Fremont Hotel and Casino downtown, and later to the Stardust, one of the premier properties on the Strip. These weren't direct ownership stakes. The Nevada Gaming Commission wouldn't license known criminals, and Frank was increasingly on law enforcement's radar. Instead, the mob controlled these casinos through a complex web of hidden ownership, strawmen, loans from the Teamsters, and outright corruption of the people who were supposed to be regulating the industry. The scheme was beautifully simple in concept, though complex in execution. Casinos count their money, right? They have to report their earnings to the Nevada Gaming Commission and pay taxes on their profits. But what if you took money out before it was ever counted? What if cash from the tables went directly into bags, skipped the counting room, and was never reported? That's skimming, and it was the greatest source of untaxed, untraceable cash in organized crime history. Frank's role in the skim was carefully orchestrated. He didn't fly to Vegas every week. That would draw attention. Instead, he had trusted representatives on the ground. These were Milwaukee guys, men who'd proven their loyalty over years of working for Frank. Men who understood that their lives literally depended on honesty in handling the boss's money. They worked in various capacities in the casinos, as managers, supervisors, even as floor staff, and their real job was to ensure that Milwaukee's share of the skim made it back to Wisconsin. The amount of money involved was staggering. We're talking millions of dollars annually, and that's in 1970s dollars. Money that was never reported, never taxed, never even acknowledged to exist. It flowed out of Vegas in a steady stream, carried by couriers, hidden in luggage, wired through complex banking schemes, and sometimes just driven across the country in cars with hidden compartments. Back in Milwaukee, this Vegas money transformed Frank's operation. He no longer had to focus on nickel and dime rackets. The Vegas skim provided consistent, massive revenue that could be invested in legitimate businesses, used to expand operations, or simply enjoyed as the spoils of empire. Frank bought more properties. He expanded his vending machine business. He loaned money to politicians and businessmen, creating debts that would prove useful later. He lived well, though never ostentatiously enough to draw unwanted attention. But the Vegas operation wasn't without its complications. For one thing, Milwaukee wasn't the only family with a piece of the action. Chicago had its share. Kansas City had its share. Even smaller families from Cleveland and Detroit had their hands in the pot. Coordinating all these different interests, making sure everyone got their fair share, avoiding conflicts that could turn violent. This required constant attention and diplomatic skill. Frank excelled at this kind of management. He attended meetings in Chicago, Kansas City, even occasionally flying to New York or Florida to meet with other crime bosses. These weren't social calls. They were business meetings where territories were respected, conflicts were resolved, and most importantly, where the money was divided. The commission, as this loosely affiliated group of mob bosses was known, operated like a criminal board of directors, and Frank had earned his seat through a combination of the wealth he controlled and the respect he commanded. One of the most fascinating aspects of Frank's Vegas years was his relationship with Alan Glick. a legitimate businessman who became the front man for mob control of several Vegas casinos. Glick, a former real estate developer and Vietnam veteran, was set up by the mob to obtain gaming licenses and officially owned casinos that were actually controlled by organized crime. Frank played a key role in this arrangement, helping to facilitate Teamsters loans that allowed Glick to purchase the Stardust and Fremont casinos. On paper, Glick owned these properties. In reality, he was a puppet, and Frank Balistrieri was one of the puppeteers. Glick would later testify that he was told in no uncertain terms that he didn't actually run these casinos, he just held them for their real owners. And when Glick tried to assert actual control, when he questioned the skim or tried to make independent decisions, he was quickly reminded of who really called the shots. There were threats, intimidation, and very clear messages that cooperation was his only viable option, but the Vegas gravy train, lucrative as it was, carried inherent risks that were growing more dangerous by the year. The FBI had long suspected that mob money was behind many Vegas casinos, but proving it was another matter. The system was designed with plausible deniability built in at every level. The guys actually taking the money didn't know where it was going. The guys receiving the money could claim it came from legitimate business operations. The paper trail was deliberately tangled and obscured. However, the FBI was getting smarter and more sophisticated. They were using wiretaps, not just on phones, but planting bugs in homes and offices and cars. They were developing informants from within the mob, offering witness protection and reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. They were following money trails with forensic accountants who could track cash through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. The net was tightening, though Frank didn't fully realize how tight it had become. The late 1970s brought the first serious cracks in the Vegas operation. In 1976, Alan Glick went to the FBI. He'd had enough of being a frontman for the mob, enough of the threats and intimidation, and he decided to cooperate with federal investigators. His testimony would eventually help convict multiple mob bosses from different families, but that was still years away. At first, Glick's cooperation was a closely guarded secret, and the skim continued. Frank's position during this period was increasingly precarious, though he may not have fully grasped it. He was being surveilled constantly. FBI agents followed him, photographed him, documented his meetings with known criminals. They planted bugs in his office. They intercepted his communications. They were building a case, brick by brick, wiretap by wiretap, witness by witness. And Frank, for all his intelligence and caution, couldn't completely avoid the surveillance net that was closing around him. The lifestyle during these years was a strange contradiction. On one hand, Frank was phenomenally wealthy and powerful. He had influence over politicians, judges, police officials. He could make things happen with a phone call. He had homes, cars, respect from both the legitimate and criminal worlds. On the other hand, he was constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly aware that one wrong move, one loose word, one disloyal associate could bring everything crashing down. His family life remained carefully compartmentalized. Nina and the children lived in relative normalcy, at least on the surface. The kids went to college. Family dinners still happened. Church attendance continued. But the secrets within the family were becoming harder to maintain. The children were growing up, becoming more aware of who their father really was and what. He really did. Some embraced it. Others struggled with the contradiction between the loving father they knew at home and the criminal boss he was on the streets, the Vegas. Years also brought Frank into contact with a wider array of criminals and characters than he'd known in Milwaukee. Vegas was where all the mob families intersected, where gangsters from across the country came to play and do business. Frank met with legendary mob figures, Anthony Spilatro, the Chicago outfit's enforcer in Vegas, who would later inspire Joe Pesci's character in the movie Casino. He dealt with casino executives who knew the skim was happening, but looked the other way because they were either paid off or intimidated. He navigated relationships with corrupt politicians and gaming officials who took bribes to ensure the kinsurvey. Mob's continued operation, but perhaps the most significant aspect of the Vegas years was how they changed Frank's perspective. Milwaukee was comfortable, familiar, controllable. Vegas was wild, unpredictable, and ultimately uncontrollable. There were too many moving parts, too many different families with competing interests, too much federal attention. Frank began to realize that Vegas, for all its profitability, might be a trap. The money was incredible, but the risk was becoming unacceptable. By the late 1970s, smart mob bosses were already looking for exit strategies from Vegas. The skim was becoming too risky. The FBI was too close. The Gaming Commission was getting less corrupt and more professional. Corporate ownership of casinos was beginning, which would eventually push the mob out entirely. The golden age of mob-controlled Vegas was ending, though it would take another decade for the transformation to be complete. Frank, ever the strategist, began quietly reducing his Vegas exposure. He didn't pull out entirely. The money was too good for that. But he started diversifying again, looking for opportunities that carried less federal heat. Unfortunately, it was too little, too late. The FBI had already gathered enough evidence to move against him, and when they finally did, the empire that had taken decades to build would begin to crumble in a matter of months. The Vegas years had been glorious, profitable, and exciting, but they'd also sown the seeds of Frank Balistrieri's eventual downfall. The money that flowed so freely from those desert casinos came with a price that Frank would ultimately have to pay. And that price would be measured in years behind bars and the destruction of the dynasty he'd worked so hard to build. Asterisk. The year was 1978, and if you were paying attention, you could feel the change in the air. The FBI wasn't just investigating organized crime anymore. They were dismantling it, piece by piece, family by family. New laws, new tactics, new technology. The old ways of doing business, the ways that had protected men like Frank Balistrieri for decades, were becoming obsolete. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, was the game changer. Passed in 1970, but not aggressively used until the late 70s, RICO allowed prosecutors to go after entire organizations rather than just individual crimes. Under RICO, if you could prove that someone was part of a criminal enterprise, you could charge them with every crime that enterprise committed, even if they didn't personally commit those crimes. For mob bosses like Frank, who insulated themselves from street-level crimes through layers of subordinates, RICO was a nightmare. But RICO was just the legal framework. The real danger came from something more personal, more insidious: betrayal. The FBI's most powerful weapon wasn't wiretaps or surveillance. It was turning mobsters against each other, convincing them that loyalty to the organization wasn't worth spending the rest of their life in prison. Got the first crack in Frank's armor came from an unexpected direction. Alan Glick, the front man for the mob-controlled Vegas casinos. Glick had been cooperating with the FBI since 1976, but his cooperation remained secret for several years. During that time, he continued to operate the casinos while wearing a wire, recording conversations with mob representatives, documenting the skim operation, and building the FBI's case from the inside. When Glick's cooperation became public, it sent shockwaves through the mob world. This wasn't some low-level associate looking to save his own skin. This was a man who'd been at the center of a multi-million-dollar operation, who'd dealt with bosses from multiple families, who had intimate knowledge of how the whole system worked. His testimony alone could bring down dozens of mobsters from cities across America. Frank's initial reaction was disbelief. How could someone betray the organization like this? The Code of Omerta, the Sicilian code of silence that had protected the mob for generations, was supposed to be absolute. Death before dishonor. Your word was your bond. You went to prison rather than cooperate with authorities. But that code was dying, killed by RICO statutes that could put you away for life and witness protection programs that could give you a new identity in some quiet suburb far from the reach of mob retribution. The FBI's investigation into Frank intensified dramatically. They had wiretaps on his office phones. They had bugs in his car. They were photographing everyone who met with him, building a web of associations that would later be used to prove the existence of a criminal enterprise. Every conversation was potentially being recorded. Every meeting could be surveilled. Paranoia became a necessary survival skill. Frank tried to adapt. He became more cautious about what he said and where he said it. He started using payphones for sensitive conversations. He spoke in code even when he thought he was in private. He met associates while walking in parks or driving around, places where planting bugs was more difficult. But the FBI was patient and resourceful. They didn't need every conversation, just enough to establish a pattern, to prove conspiracy, to show that Frank was directing a criminal organization. Then came another blow. Informants from within his own organization. The FBI wasn't just targeting Frank. They were targeting everyone in his crew, squeezing them with evidence of their own crimes, offering deals in exchange for cooperation. Some stood firm, refusing to cooperate even under tremendous pressure. But others, facing decades in prison, decided that the old code wasn't worth their entire lives. Each informant provided another piece of the puzzle. They could testify about orders Frank had given. They could describe the structure of his organization. They could detail specific crimes and connect those crimes to Frank's leadership. The case against him was becoming overwhelming, built on a foundation of wiretaps, surveillance, financial records, and witness testimony. Asterisk, the strain was beginning to show. Frank, who'd always been composed and calculating, started making mistakes. He became more suspicious of his own associates, wondering who might be wearing a wire or talking to the FBI. This suspicion, while often justified, created tension within the organization. Trust, the glue that held criminal enterprises together, was eroding. His family life suffered too. Nina knew something was wrong, even if Frank tried to shield her from the details. The children, now adults, could see the pressure their father was under. FBI agents would occasionally approach family members trying to flip them, suggesting they could avoid their own legal troubles by cooperating against Frank. The psychological warfare was relentless. In 1980, the hammer fell. Frank Balistrieri was indicted on multiple charges related to the Vegas skim operation. The indictment alleged that he and other mob bosses from Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Chicago had conspired to skim millions of dollars from Vegas casinos, evading taxes and defrauding legitimate casino owners. The evidence was extensive: wiretaps, witness testimony, financial records showing unexplained cash movements, and most damning, the testimony of Alan Glick himself. Frank's response was characteristic: deny everything, attack the credibility of the witnesses, fight every charge in court. He hired the best lawyers money could buy. He challenged the legality of the wiretaps. He questioned the credibility of informants who were testifying to save themselves from prison. He maintained the facade of legitimacy, insisting he was just a businessman being persecuted by overzealous federal agents, but the legal strategy could only do so much. The evidence was simply too strong. The FBI had recorded conversations where Frank discussed the skim. They had financial records showing money flowing from Vegas to Milwaukee through channels that couldn't be explained by any legitimate business. They had multiple witnesses willing to testify about Frank's role in the operation. The trial, when it finally happened, was a media sensation. Milwaukee's mob boss on trial for running a criminal empire that stretched to Las Vegas. Testimony about millions of dollars in skimmed cash. Revelations about mob control of major casinos. It was everything the public imagined about organized crime, confirmed in open court. Frank maintained his composure throughout. He sat in the courtroom in expensive suits, showing no emotion as former associates testified against him. He consulted with his lawyers during breaks. He never admitted guilt, never showed weakness. To the end, he was the boss, maintaining the image of strength and control, even as his empire crumbled around him. But privately, the betrayals cut deep. Men he'd trusted, men he'd made wealthy, men who'd sworn loyalty, they were testifying against him to save themselves. The code of Omerta was dead, and Frank was witnessing its funeral in real time. Each day of testimony was another nail in the coffin of the old ways of doing business. His sons were also facing legal troubles. The FBI had gone after the entire family, charging his sons with various crimes related to Frank's organization. This was perhaps the cruelest cut of all, seeing his children dragged into the legal system, facing prison time for following in their father's footsteps. Frank had built an empire partly to provide for his family, to give them wealth and opportunity. Now that same empire was destroying them. The verdict, when it came, was inevitable. Guilty on multiple counts. Frank Balistrieri, who'd ruled Milwaukee's underworld for 2 decades, who'd built a criminal empire that stretched from Wisconsin to Nevada, who'd sat down with the most powerful mob bosses in America, was now a convicted felon facing a lengthy prison sentence. The sentencing hearing was brief. The judge, clearly disgusted by the evidence of Frank's criminal career, handed down a substantial sentence. Frank would be going to federal prison, and at his age, there was a real possibility he'd die there. The Whiskey King's reign was over, but even in defeat, Frank maintained his dignity. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't make excuses. He accepted the sentence stoically, as if it were just another business setback rather than the end of everything he'd built. As marshals led him away, Frank Balistrieri walked with his head high, the boss to the very end. The walls had closed in. The investigations had succeeded. The betrayals had proven more damaging than any law enforcement tactic. And Frank Balistrieri, architect of Milwaukee's most successful criminal organization, was about to learn what life was like on the other side of those walls, not as a boss giving orders, but as a federal prisoner with a number instead of a name. * Federal Correctional Institution, Sandstone, Minnesota. Not the worst prison in the federal system, but not a country club either. This would be Frank Balistrieri's home for the next several years, a dramatic fall from the power and freedom he'd enjoyed for decades. Prison for a mob boss is different than prison for an average inmate. Frank arrived with a reputation and, in the strange ecosystem of the federal prison system, reputation meant something. Other inmates knew who he was, what he'd done, the power he'd wielded. Some were in awe. Some were looking to make a name for themselves by challenging him. Most just gave him a wide berth, recognizing that even behind bars, Frank Balistrieri was not a man to be trifled with. The daily routine was a shot to someone who'd spent his adult life making his own schedule, running his own show. Wake up, calls, meal times, work assignments, counts, everything regimented, controlled, monitored. For a man who'd controlled so much of Milwaukee's underworld, being controlled by corrections officers must have been a special kind of humiliation. But Frank adapted, as he always had. He fell into the prison routine without complaint. He worked his assigned job, usually something mindless like laundry or food service. He kept to himself mostly, though he occasionally met with other inmates who shared his Sicilian heritage or mob connections. These meetings were carefully monitored by prison authorities, who were always alert for signs that Frank might be trying to continue running his organization from behind bars. In reality, his organization was falling apart. Without him, with Frank in prison, the Milwaukee family lost its cohesion. His sons tried to hold things together, but they lacked their father's authority and strategic vision. Associates started operating independently or getting absorbed into larger organizations like the Chicago outfit. The tight ship Frank had run for 2 decades became a loose collection of individual criminals without central direction. The Vegas skim, of course, was completely finished. The FBI's crackdown had destroyed that operation across multiple cities. Several other mob bosses who'd been involved, including bosses from Kansas City and Chicago, were also doing time in federal prisons. The golden age of mob-controlled Vegas was over, replaced by increasingly corporate ownership that had no use for the old criminal partnerships. Frank's time in prison was marked by reflection, though he'd never admit to regret. He read extensively: history books, biographies, legal texts. He followed news about organized crime, watching as federal prosecutions continued to dismantle mob families across the country. The 5 families in New York were being decimated by RICO prosecutions. The Chicago outfit was reeling from similar legal attacks. The Philadelphia family, the New England family, all falling like dominoes. He must have wondered, could he have avoided this fate? Were there choices he could have made differently? Should he have gotten out of Vegas earlier? Should he have been more careful about who he trusted? But these questions were academic now. The decisions were made, the consequences were being lived, Visits from family were bittersweet. Nina came regularly, maintaining her loyalty even as her husband's empire crumbled. She brought news from Milwaukee, updates about the children, reminders of the life that existed beyond prison walls. His children visited too, though some more frequently than others. The conversations were carefully monitored, limited to innocuous topics. Nothing that could be construed as continuing to run criminal operations. Frank's health began to decline in prison. The stress of his legal troubles, combined with age and the harsh reality of prison life, took their toll. He developed various ailments, received basic medical care from prison doctors, and stoically endured the indignity of being just another sick inmate in a system that processed thousands like him. But even in prison, Frank remained a figure of fascination. Journalists requested interviews, which he always declined. True crime authors wanted to write his biography, which he refused to authorize. Hollywood came calling, wanting to make movies about his life, and he wanted nothing to do with it. Frank Balistrieri, even in defeat, controlled what could and couldn't be said about him. Other inmates would sometimes ask him about the old days, about Vegas and Milwaukee, and the life he'd lived. Frank would occasionally share stories, carefully edited to avoid incriminating himself or others, tales of a world most of these men only knew from movies and television. He became, in a way, a living artifact of organized crime's golden age, a connection to an era that was rapidly fading into history. The code that had defined his life, omerta, was everywhere violated now. RICO had changed everything. Witness protection made cooperation survivable. Life sentences made cooperation logical. Frank watched as man after man, including some he'd known personally, chose cooperation over loyalty. He never would have made that choice, whether from principle or pride. He would go to his grave without becoming a rat. But he could see why others did. The world had changed, and the old codes couldn't survive in the new reality. In 1991, after serving approximately 8 years of his sentence, Frank Balistrieri was released from federal prison. He was 73 years old, his health deteriorated, his empire destroyed, his legacy complicated. The man who'd ruled Milwaukee's underworld for 2 decades walked out of prison into a world that had moved on without him. Milwaukee, in the early 1990s, bore little resemblance to the city Frank had dominated in the 1960s and 70s. The mob's influence had waned dramatically. The FBI's prosecutions had been devastatingly effective. Young criminals now gravitated toward different crimes, drugs primarily, which the traditional mob had always avoided as too risky and morally problematic. The Balistrieri name still carried weight in certain circles, but it was the weight of history, not current power. Frank returned to his family, diminished but not defeated. He couldn't legally participate in many activities due to his felony convictions. He couldn't vote. He couldn't own firearms. He couldn't legally be involved in certain businesses. His movements were restricted by parole conditions. The man who'd once moved freely through the highest and lowest levels of society was now constrained by the consequences of his criminal life. He spent his final years quietly, surrounded by family, removed from the criminal world he'd once dominated. There were no dramatic comebacks, no attempts to reclaim power, no last great scores. Frank Balistrieri in his final years was simply an old man, reflecting on a life lived outside the law, dealing with the physical and legal consequences of Choices made decades earlier, his health continued to decline. The various ailments that had begun in prison worsened. Medical care became a regular part of his life, a far cry from the vigorous, commanding presence he'd been in his prime. His family cared for him, Nina particularly, remaining loyal through everything: the trials, the prison years, the faded glory of their final years together. On February 7th, 1993, Frank Balistrieri died. He was 74 years old. The death certificate listed natural causes, medical conditions exacerbated by age and stress, and the hard life he'd lived. The Whiskey King was dead. His dynasty ended not with violence or drama, but with the quiet finality of an old man's passing. The funeral was well attended, a mixture of legitimate mourners, family, old friends from the neighborhood, and federal agents photographing everyone who showed up, still building files, still tracking who might be continuing criminal enterprises. Even in death, Frank Balistrieri couldn't escape the surveillance that had defined his later years. News reports of his death were respectful but honest. They acknowledged his role as Milwaukee's mob boss, his connections to Vegas, his criminal conviction. There were no eulogies that glossed over his criminal career, but also no gloating about his downfall. Frank Balistrieri had been a significant figure in Milwaukee's history, for better or worse, and his passing marked the end of an era. The legacy he left was complicated. To his family, he was a provider, a patriarch who'd given them wealth and opportunity. To law enforcement, he was a criminal who'd corrupted institutions and lived outside the law for profit. To the city of Milwaukee, he was a reminder of a time when organized crime wielded real power in American cities. To historians of organized crime, he was a case study in how even smart, sophisticated mob bosses ultimately couldn't escape the chaos. Long arm of the law, the empire Frank built didn't survive him. His sons faced their own legal troubles. His organization fragmented and dissolved. The legitimate businesses were sold off. The criminal enterprises either died out or were absorbed by other organizations. Within a decade of his death, the Milwaukee mob, as Frank had known it, essentially ceased to exist as a coherent organization. But the story of Frank Balistrieri, the grocer's son who became Wisconsin's Whiskey King, who built a bootleg dynasty that stretched from Milwaukee to Las Vegas, who wielded power over politicians and police and unions, who ultimately fell to federal prosecutions and betrayals and the changing nature of crime itself. That story endures. It's a purely American story of ambition and achievement and the price paid for living outside the law. Asterisk. When you examine the life of Frank Balistrieri with the clarity that only distance and time can provide, you're forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about America, about ambition, about the price of power, and about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. Let's start with the most obvious question. Was Frank Balistrieri a successful man? By conventional measures, absolutely. He built a multi-million-dollar organization from essentially nothing. He went from being the son of a grocer to sitting down with some of the most powerful criminals in America. He lived in nice homes, wore expensive clothes, provided for his family, commanded respect and fear in equal measure. For decades, he was one of the most powerful men in Milwaukee, able to influence politicians, control unions, and determine the success or failure of legitimate businesses. But success at what cost? He spent years in federal prison. His sons faced legal troubles because they followed in his footsteps. His organization crumbled after his incarceration. He lived under constant surveillance and threat of violence. His business was crime, which meant his success was built on the suffering of others, the gambling addicts who couldn't stop betting, the business owners who paid protection money, the workers whose union pension funds were looted, the legitimate casino owners whose profits were skimmed. Frank's story is, in many ways, the story of organized crime in 20th century America. It's a story about how prohibition creates black markets and black markets create criminal entrepreneurs. It's about how poverty and prejudice can push talented, ambitious people toward illegal means of success when legal means are restricted. Italian immigrants in the early 1900s faced tremendous discrimination. Legitimate business success was harder for them than for Anglo-Americans. Crime became, for some, a faster route to the American dream, but it's also a story about choices. Frank Balistrieri wasn't forced into crime by poverty. His father ran a legitimate business. Frank went to law school. He had options that many others didn't. He chose crime not because it was his only option, but because it was the most lucrative option. The path to power and influence that legitimate business couldn't match. The Teamsters connection is particularly instructive. The Central States Pension Fund, which Frank helped exploit, was supposed to provide retirement security for working-class union members. Instead, it became a slush fund for mob operations, loaning money to mob-controlled businesses and casinos, often without proper collateral or expectation of repayment. Those were real workers' pensions being gambled and stolen. When businesses failed or loans went unpaid, it was union members' retirement security that suffered. The Vegas operation, for all its glamour and profit, represented one of the largest tax frauds in American history. The millions of dollars that Frank and other mob bosses skimmed from casinos was money that should have been reported, taxed, and used for public services. It was theft from every law-abiding taxpayer in America. The romantic image of the mob-controlled Vegas of the 1960s and 70s obscures the reality. It was a massive criminal enterprise built on fraud and corruption. Yet we have to acknowledge the complexity. Frank wasn't a thug or a street-level criminal. He was intelligent, strategic, and in his own way, principled. He followed the code of omerta, even when it would have been in his interest to cooperate. He maintained his family relationships and community ties. He supported legitimate businesses and employed people who needed jobs. The portrait isn't simple. It's not good man or bad man, but something more complicated and human. His downfall offers lessons too. The FBI's success against Frank and other mob bosses in the 1980s came from three things: better laws, RICO, better technology, wiretaps and surveillance, and breaking the code of silence, turning informants. The mob had operated for decades under the assumption that members wouldn't cooperate with authorities. Once that assumption proved false, once witness protection made cooperation safe, and RICO made cooperation necessary to avoid life sentences, the entire structure collapsed. Frank's insistence on maintaining the traditional code became a liability. Younger mobsters, facing decades in prison under RICO statutes, looked at men like Frank, loyal to the end, dying after years in prison with nothing to show for their loyalty, and decided the code wasn't worth their lives. The world changed, but Frank couldn't or wouldn't change with it. That inflexibility, that adherence to old ways in a new era, ultimately destroyed him and the organization he built. There's also the question of Frank's relationship with legitimate society. He corrupted police officers, politicians, and union officials. He operated businesses that appeared legitimate but existed primarily to launder criminal proceeds or facilitate illegal activities. He blurred the line between legal and illegal, legitimate and criminal. This corruption of institutions is in many ways more damaging than street-level crime. It erodes public trust in the very systems that are supposed to protect society from criminals. Yet Milwaukee's establishment accepted Frank for years. Politicians met with him. Police officers took his money. Legitimate businessmen partnered with him. This wasn't because they didn't know who he was. It was because he was useful to them. Frank could deliver votes, labor peace, contributions to campaigns. He could make things happen. The corruption ran both ways, from the criminal underworld into the legitimate overworld. His family's story is perhaps the most tragic aspect. Nina Balistrieri remained loyal through everything, standing by her husband through trials in prison and the collapse of everything they'd built. Did she know what Frank really did? Almost certainly. Did she have a choice about the life she lived? That's less clear. Mob wives in that era existed in a complicated space, benefiting from their husbands. Criminal success while being excluded from the details. Expected to maintain respectable facades while knowing dark truths. His children faced similar complications. They grew up in wealth, attended good schools, had opportunities. But those opportunities came from crime. And when some of them followed their father into the life, they faced the same legal consequences he did. Frank wanted to build something for his family, a legacy that would outlast him. Instead, he built something that ultimately harmed them, pulling them into legal troubles and forever marking them with the stain of their father's crimes. The Milwaukee that exists today shows little obvious trace of Frank Balistrieri's influence. The Third Ward has been gentrified. The mob doesn't control unions or politicians like it once did. Federal prosecutors broke the back of organized crime in the city. But the history is still there if you know where to look. Old buildings where Frank did business. Streets where his influence once ran strong. Families who remember, for better or worse, the era when the Balistrieris were a power in the city. In the broader context of American organized crime history, Frank sits in an interesting position. He wasn't as famous as Al Capone or Lucky Luciano. He didn't run one of the 5 families of New York. He operated in what many considered a second-tier city. Yet in many ways, Frank was more representative of the typical mob boss than the famous. Names. Most organized crime in America wasn't centered in New York or Chicago. It was in cities like Milwaukee, where regional crime families controlled local rackets, connected with larger organizations when beneficial, and operated largely under the national radar. That his Vegas connection elevated him beyond regional importance, putting him in the same circles as mob bosses from major families. The skim operation was truly national in scope, involving families from across the country. In that sense, Frank punched above his weight, leveraging Milwaukee's relatively small family into a seat at one of the biggest tables in organized crime. That the lessons from Frank's life aren't simple moral tales. Yes, crime doesn't pay in the end. He died after prison, his empire destroyed. But for decades, it did pay handsomely. Yes, loyalty is important, but his loyalty to the code kept him from cooperating when cooperation might have reduced his prison time. Yes, Family is important, but his criminal career ultimately harmed his family more than it helped them. Perhaps the real lesson is about the American dream itself and its dark reflection. Frank achieved a version of the American dream, rising from humble immigrant roots to wealth and power. But he did so through crime, corruption, and violence. His success came at the expense of others. His empire was built on exploitation. The dream he achieved was twisted, corrupted, ultimately hollow. We romanticize mob history in America. We make movies that glorify gangsters. We're fascinated by the power, the money, the breaking of rules. Frank Balistrieri's life, examined, honestly shows the reality behind the romance. Yes, there was power and money, but there was also constant fear, betrayal, prison, families torn apart, lives ruined. The glamour was a thin veneer over something much darker and sadder as we move forward, and Frank's era recedes further into history. His story becomes less about the individual man and more about what he represented, a particular moment in American history when organized crime wielded real power, when the law was still catching up to sophisticated criminal enterprises, when the old codes and old ways still held sway before. RICO and witness protection changed everything. Frank Balistrieri built an empire and watched it fall. He lived by a code that no longer protected him. He achieved success by one measure and utter failure by another. His legacy is complicated, contradictory, and thoroughly American. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all, that the stories we tell ourselves about success, power, and the American dream are never as simple as we'd like them to be. So here we are, at the end of Frank Balistrieri's story. We've traveled from the streets of Milwaukee's Third Ward to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, from the heights of criminal power to the lows of federal prison, from the American dream to its nightmare reflection. But what does it all mean? What are we supposed to take away from the life of Wisconsin's Whiskey King? The truth is, Frank Balistrieri's story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about ourselves and the society we live in. We say we value the rule of law, yet Frank operated in open defiance of it for decades with tacit support from elements of the establishment. We say we condemn corruption, yet politicians and police officers and businessmen all benefited from relationships with Frank while looking the other way at his crimes. We say crime doesn't pay, yet Frank lived in luxury for most of his life and only faced serious consequences in his 60s. The American mob, and Frank's place in it, was never just about crime. It was about power and who gets to wield it. It was about immigrant communities creating their own paths to success when legitimate paths were blocked by discrimination. It was about the hypocrisies of a society that passed laws it didn't seriously intend to enforce and created black markets as a result. Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just made criminals out of people who provided what others wanted. Frank understood this fundamental truth. People want what they want, regardless of what the law says. They want to gamble. They want to drink. They want to cut corners to get ahead. Frank simply facilitated these desires and took his cut. Was he creating the demand or just meeting it? That's a question we still struggle with today regarding drugs, prostitution, gambling, and countless other illegal activities that persist despite decades of enforcement. But let's not romanticize too much. Frank wasn't Robin Hood. He wasn't stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He was a criminal who used violence, intimidation, and corruption to build personal wealth and power. People were hurt by his actions. Families were destroyed by gambling addictions he profited from. Workers lost pension money that was loaned to mob enterprises. Legitimate businesses paid protection money or faced violence. The romantic image of the gentleman gangster obscures real suffering. The fall of Frank and the Milwaukee family he built represents a turning point in American crime. RICO changed everything because it allowed prosecutors to go after the organization rather than just individual crimes. Witness protection changed everything because it broke the code of silence that had protected the mob for generations. Technology changed everything because bugs and wiretaps made private conversations public evidence. But perhaps most importantly, the world changed. The mob thrived in an era when cash was king and official records were sparse. In an increasingly digital, transparent, documented world, traditional mob operations became exponentially harder. You can't skim from modern casinos the way you could in the 1970s. The surveillance is too good. The accounting too precise. The gaming commissions too vigilant. You can't control unions as easily when every transaction leaves a digital trail. You can't buy politicians as easily when campaign finance is somewhat more transparent. Frank's sons didn't inherit his empire because the empire couldn't exist in the new world. The organization required constant personal relationships and management, and that couldn't be passed down like a legitimate business. When Frank went to prison, the cohesion disappeared. And even if it hadn't, the FBI was waiting, ready to prosecute the next generation just as they'd prosecuted Frank. There's a melancholy to Frank's final years that's worth considering. Here was a man who'd wielded tremendous power, who'd sat down with the most dangerous criminals in America, who'd controlled millions of dollars and influenced the lives of thousands of people. And he ended his life as an old man under parole supervision, his health failing, his empire gone, forbidden from even voting. The mighty fall is a cliché because it's a pattern that repeats throughout history, and Frank's fall was as complete as they come. Yet even in that fall, there's a kind of dignity. Frank never cooperated. He never became a rat. He did his time without complaining, without writing tell-all books, without giving interviews to journalists hungry for mob stories. He maintained the code even when the code no longer served any purpose except personal honor. Whether you see that as admirable principle or stubborn foolishness probably says more about you than about Frank. The relationship between organized crime and American society has always been symbiotic in ways we don't like to admit. The mob provided services people wanted, but society declared illegal. They employed people in immigrant communities when legitimate employment was hard to find. They enforced contracts and resolved disputes in areas where the legal system was slow or ineffective or biased. They were a shadow government for shadow. Citizens, people who felt, often justifiably, that the legitimate government didn't represent their interests. Frank thrived in that shadow world. He understood its rules better than almost anyone. He navigated between crime and legitimacy, between violence and diplomacy, between the old Sicilian ways and the new American realities. He built something remarkable, even if that something was fundamentally criminal. His story is a cautionary tale, certainly. The message is clear. Even if you're smart, even if you're careful, even if you play the game perfectly for decades, eventually the law catches up. Eventually, someone betrays you. Eventually, the world changes and the old ways stop working. Crime might pay for a while, even for a long while, but the final payment comes due, and it's usually more than you can afford. But his story is also a tragic tale about wasted potential. Imagine if Frank's intelligence, strategic thinking, and organizational skills had been applied to legitimate business. He could have been a successful corporate executive, a prominent lawyer, a political leader. He had the tools for legitimate success. He chose crime instead, not because he had to, but because it offered faster rewards and greater power. That choice defined his life and ultimately destroyed the empire he built. The families that loved these men, the Ninas and the children who stood by them, they're the forgotten casualties of mob history. They benefited from the criminal proceeds, true, but they also suffered in ways that movies and TV shows rarely depict. The constant fear, the surveillance, the legal troubles, the knowledge that everything you have could disappear overnight, the judgment from society, the complicated legacy of loving someone who caused so much harm. As we close this story, it's worth thinking about what Frank Balistrieri represents in the larger American narrative. He represents ambition unconstrained by law. He represents the dark side of the American dream, the version where success justifies any means. He represents a time when organized crime was more organized and more criminal than it is today, when the mob actually controlled significant parts of American industry and politics. But he also represents something more universal, the human desire for power, respect, and legacy. Frank wanted what we all want, to be someone, to matter, to leave something behind. He just chose a path that ultimately led to prison, betrayal, and the destruction of everything he built. Milwaukee today shows little trace of Frank's influence. The Third Ward is trendy coffee shops and art galleries. The casinos he skimmed from in Vegas have been demolished or corporatized. The union locals he controlled have new leadership. The politicians he influenced are long gone. It's like he was never there, like the empire never existed. All that remains is memory, and as the people who knew Frank die off, even that fades. But the story persists because it's fundamentally a human story. Frank Balistrieri was a criminal, yes, but he was also a husband, a father, a son of immigrants. A man trying to build something in a world that didn't make it easy. He made terrible choices with terrible consequences. But he made those choices as a human being, not a cartoon villain. And understanding why he made them tells us something about ourselves and the key, society that created him. The bootleg dynasty is gone. The Whiskey King is dead. The empire fell, but the story remains, a testament to ambition, criminality, loyalty, betrayal, power, and ultimately, the inescapable weight of consequence. Frank Balistrieri lived a life that most of us can't imagine and hopefully would never want. But examining that life, understanding it, learning from it, that's valuable. Because the temptations Frank faced, the choices he made, the rationalizations he used, those are universal. We all face our own versions of them, even if the stakes are different and the consequences less severe. In the end, Frank Balistrieri built a dynasty on whiskey and vice and violence and watched it crumble to dust. He reached for the American dream and grasped instead its shadow. He wanted to be remembered as a king, and history will remember him as a criminal. But he was, above all, human, flawed, complex, contradictory, and ultimately tragic. That's the final truth from the shadows. Behind every crime empire is a person. Behind every mob boss is a human being. And understanding the human doesn't excuse the crime. But it does help us understand how good people can make terrible choices and how systems of corruption can persist when we all agree to look the other way. Frank Balistrieri's Bootleg Dynasty is history now, a story from a different America. But the lessons remain as relevant today as they were in Frank's time. The rule of law matters. Corruption corrodes everything it touches. Loyalty is admirable, but not if it's loyalty to the wrong things. And success built on the suffering of others is no success at all. No matter how much money you make or how much power you wield, the shadows of history have many stories to tell, and Frank Balistrieri's is just one of them. But it's a story worth remembering, worth studying, worth learning from. Because the darkness is always there, always offering power and wealth to those willing to step into it. And knowing what happened to those who accepted that offer might just help us make better choices when we face our own temptations. Asterisk. The story of Frank Balistrieri, Wisconsin's Whiskey King, is one of ambition, power, crime, and consequence. From the streets of Milwaukee's Third Ward to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, from the heights of criminal empire to the depths of federal prison, his life embodied both the dark allure and the ultimate futility of the gangster's path. If you found this journey through the shadows of history compelling, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about Frank's story? Do you see him as a criminal who got what he deserved, or a product of his time and circumstances? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing different perspectives on these complex historical figures. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the underworld, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore the hidden histories, the untold stories, and the complicated truths behind America's most fascinating gangsters and criminal organizations. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. The shadows of history hold countless stories like Frank's, tales of power and ambition, crime and consequence, loyalty and betrayal. Each one teaches us something about human nature, about American society, about the thin line between the legal and the criminal, the legitimate and the corrupt. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Frank Balistrieri's Bootleg Dynasty. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, the most interesting stories often come from the darkest places. Now tell me, whose story should we explore next? Let me know in the comments.